Yo, back up in the basement. Last time we went over 2205, 2206, 1A, and 2207. 2207 being these are fairly important to remember. Um, Moving on, we're gonna start with 2209, and this is modification, rescission, and waiver. The language of it, only because I don't remember it that well. An agreement modifying a contract with this article needs no consideration to be binding. A signed contract which excludes modification or rescission except by a signed writing cannot be otherwise modified or rescinded, but except as between merchants, such a requirement on a form supplied by the merchant must be separately signed by the other party. Okay, so summarizing that one, agreements to modify contracts don't need consideration. Okay, so if you have a contract going and you need to change things, I think one is just saying that you don't need to add additional consideration to change things. The existing one is fine because it's all part of the same deal. I think that kind of makes sense. If you made a deal and you just need to adapt or change something, you don't need to offer something else. Two is I wrote down if agreements say can't modify, then you can't modify. Um, and if between merchants, okay, yeah. So if a contract itself says you can't modify it, then you just can't do it. Which makes sense. You can, if it's between merchants, like change it, change a contract if you need be with a separate form. Um, so that just means here also, if it's not between merchants, then this this just stands that an agreement can't be modified if it says you can't be modified. Okay. Three, the requirements of the statute of fraud section of this article must be satisfied if the contract as modified is within its provisions. And so if you want to modify, it has to fall within the statute of frauds given the UCC. And so that just means it has to be in writing or, in writing with asterisks for now, and it has to be over $500. So inferring then if it's not under the statute of frauds through the UCC, you can't modify it. Yes. If contract as modified is within its provisions. I think that's right. Maybe not. Four, although an attempt at modification or rescission does not satisfy the requirements of subsection two or three, it can operate as a waiver. And so doesn't mean although an attempt at rescission does not satisfy the requirements, it can operate as a waiver. So just because it doesn't do two or three right here, so if it doesn't meet if you can't satisfy these, then you can still waive a part of a contract, given the offeree lets you do it. And five, a party can't retract waiver within a reasonable time frame, in short. I don't know how often 209 is going to come up. Because I don't think we spent a lot of time on it. I'm not going to say that this won't be covered because it might. So this might be kind of admitting that this is it might be worth it to read into this a little bit more than I have, because some of this is not necessarily, even my little annotations aren't so clear to me. 2305 is next. So jumping forward, this is a big one to remember. I think it's gonna come up a lot. And so this is one, if you want to star it, it's kind of one to not forget. Open price terms. And so the language of it, the parties, if they so intend, can conclude a contract for the sale, even though the price is not settled. In such a case, the price is a reasonable price at the time for the delivery. Okay, so this is saying, I mean, if just because a set price is not there, doesn't mean a contract can't be formed. And so, in other words, if through negotiations, for example, you're like, we're gonna sell this for 1 million. It's like, I was thinking 100, like 1.2 million. Like I was thinking like not that much, maybe like 1.1 million. And they just like never settled it, but they were like, it's gonna be, maybe they said to each other, it's gonna be somewhere in between there. A contract can still go through. Especially because that feels reasonable given the sheer amount, right? Where it gets kind of questionable is like if it is reasonable or not, and that is subject to a court. I mean, to be honest. And this only applies given these two potential conditions. Nothing is said as to price. And so if you never talked about the price, but you talked about everything else, maybe alluded to the price, a contract can still be formed, or the price is left to be agreed by the parties and they fail to agree. So let's say like y'all, like in that example, it's kind of the same example where y'all were talking about prices and never settled on a price. That's a perfect example of, I mean, parties never agreed, but it can still go through. Okay. 2306, output requirements and exclusive dealings. This one's a longer one. So I'm just going to skip to my annotation. One is good faith applies to terms that measure quantity of stuff. Um, so in other words, if a party doesn't output or give or kind of messes up the quantity of it, we don't automatically assume that they did it because they're malicious and they wanted to, do that in spite of the other person. We assume good faith of it. Okay. And then two is agreements of exclusive dealings with certain goods is assumed unless it was agreed upon that seller try their best and buyer tries their best to promote those goods. And so I think this kind of like intuitively makes sense when you make a deal with somebody in like merchants. I don't think this is just between merchants, like merchants and maybe just a buyer. That the deal is between y'all, and that makes sense, right? I mean, like when you make a deal with somebody, you don't kind of guess that somebody else is in the mix. Um, Unless like the merchant themselves, like in the contract, is like, well, I'm selling to you, but I also have somebody else that I have a contract, and so because my supplies is kind of limited, I'm gonna try my best to give you what you need, and I'm gonna try my best to, like, you know, fulfill the contract, and that could still be a valid thing, like it wouldn't count as a breach because of this subsection. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna power through this then. 2308. So must be goods. I put that. I'm gonna read the language of it because I don't remember this provision very well. Unless otherwise agreed. Oh, okay. The place for delivery of goods is the seller's place of business or has none, or if he has none, is in his residence. Or B, in a contract for the seller identified goods, which to the knowledge of the parties at the time of contracting are the same are in some other place, the place is the place for their delivery. So A is just simply saying that if like nothing specified as to where to deliver goods or to where to give goods, then you can safely assume that you could drop it off at their place of business. Okay, assuming merchants or buyers. Okay, and if you don't know that, but you knew at the time that when you had a contract and you talked about it and they had resided or done some of their business in this specific place, under subsection B you can just assume that that's the place, like maybe they went off somewhere and didn't tell you, and so B says you can assume that you can deliver it there. 2715, I actually won't go into this that hard, but it talks about like what kind of damages. It defines incidental damages and consequential damages. And so you can pause it here and read it yourself. I don't feel the need to elaborate on this. Next, we're going to move on to restatement of agency and then statute of frauds, which is going to be the last section for this semester.